In February 2018, under cover of darkness, a trio of poachers made their way across the South African border from Mozambique. Their destination was one of the private game reserves along the edge of the infamous Kruger National Park. It was pitch black, and they tripped and stumbled through the undergrowth as they made their way towards the wilderness. They didn't use any form of light, as they wanted to go unnoticed, but they had made this journey before. They knew the way. Living in the remote village of Mavudza in the Mesengiri area, a lot of the people lived a poor existence. 3/4 of the population is illiterate, but most survive through farming. Fields of corn, cassava, cowpea, peanut, sweet potato, and rice provide a meager income for families and food on the table. Houses are set amongst Mozambique's sandy soils and surrounded by agricultural land. Only 4% of the houses in the region have access to electricity, with little in the way of future prospects. 50-year-old David Baloyi was no stranger to this temptation and, along with 2 others, trekked into South Africa on February 9, 2018. They sneaked into the Umbabat Game Reserve, just south of the Olifants River that flows through Kruger National Park and into Mozambique. They carried little with them, only a handful of butchery tools and 2 .456 Winchester hunting rifles. They were on the lookout for big game. These weapons could take down the likes of elephant, rhino, and lion. The illegal trade in big cat products, rhino horn, and elephant tusks are huge commodities in China and the Far East. They can fetch thousands of dollars, and although the poachers themselves only see a small fraction of that price, it can make a difference to their livelihoods. They rely on this income to feed their families. Rhino horn is more valuable than gold on the black market. Poachers risk life and limb poaching prized animals. With poaching patrols stepping up across South Africa and many other African nations, poachers can catch a bullet from armed rangers. In neighboring Eswatini, they have a shoot-to-kill policy when it comes to poachers. But sometimes, it's the animals themselves that poachers are most in danger from. Usually, poachers hunt for their game during a full moon. This helps them to see better and means that they don't need to use a flashlight, which can be picked up by rangers on patrols. They typically hunt in threes. One will shoot the animal, the other will cut off the body part they are after, and the third will keep watch. Nobody knows for sure which animals David and his 2 companions were after, but when they crossed into the private game reserve that night, only 2 of them would make it back out alive. Stealthily, they stalked through the bush. Their arms were scraped by the long acacia thorns protruding from the trees. Their footsteps were quiet upon the dusty, dry earth. Their hearts beat quickly as the adrenaline of the nighttime hunt began to kick in. Flicking on their flashlights for only a few seconds at a time, they found a trail, perhaps the telltale paw prints of a lion. Crouching down low to the ground, they paused and strained their eyes in the darkness. They whispered to each other, each of them listening to the sounds of the African night. But they weren't the only ones out hunting in the darkness. The 3 Mozambican men may have been carrying deadly hunting rifles, but there was something out there that was far deadlier. With thousands of years of natural killing instinct packed into a powerful body, the African lion is responsible for an estimated 200 human fatalities each year. Male lions can grow to almost 10 feet or 3 meters long, including their tail, and can weigh almost 500 pounds or 225 kilograms. In some individuals, the canines can be as much as 4 inches or 10 centimeters long. They are generalist predators, eating a wide variety of prey species from wildebeest and zebras to gemsbok, giraffe, and buffalo. Although lions do hunt during daylight hours, they mostly rely on the cover of darkness to take down prey. Like most nocturnal animals, they possess a tapetum lucidum in their eyes, which reflects more light back through the retina, helping them to see in low light. Their night vision is 6 to 8 times better than a human's. In the dark, lions definitely have the upper hand or paw. As the men crept forwards, so too did a pride of lions. David wouldn't have heard the lionesses approaching, but it seems the 3 of them walked straight towards an approaching pride. With no time to react, David suddenly let out a loud cry, as he was knocked off his feet. He squeezed the trigger of his gun as something huge grabbed his head. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the African bush, alerting rangers far and wide. David could feel the canine sinking into his skull, and he screamed as he struggled to pull his head free. He kicked his legs and thrashed around as the immense power of the lionesses pinned him to the ground. Amongst the commotion, the other two men dropped their weapons and sprinted off in the opposite direction. David had been only feet in front of them when he was attacked. They had seen the murky outlines of several large animals diving on top of him. They heard the struggle, the moans and groans of the lions, and the screams and cries of their friend. Sheer terror gripped them as they fled, running back through the game reserve. They tripped over fallen branches and crashed through the bush. They didn't look back. Their hearts thundered in their ears as they tore through the African night. Gasping and panting, they made it to the perimeter fence and crawled through. Only once they were on the other side of the wire did they stop to catch their breath. It was a 50-mile hike back to their village. When they arrived, they had to deliver the devastating news to David's family. David had been left at the mercy of the lions. He was easy prey. His friends had abandoned him. With no way of seeing the lions in front of him, he could have walked straight into the middle of the pride. He couldn't defend himself, and it would have taken just seconds before one of the lionesses closed her jaws around his throat. Asphyxiation and exsanguination are how lions subdue their prey, and David was no exception. It wasn't a territorial attack. The lions were out on the hunt that night. They were looking for a meal. Whilst David's friends made it out alive, he was devoured by the pride of lions. The gunshots were heard by rangers who headed to the area, but when they finally located the scene of the hunt, the lions had scarpered. All that was left of David was his head. Almost his entire body had been eaten. The alarm had been sounded, and police and paramedics arrived on scene when daylight broke. David's remains were transported to Mafuta Malati Hospital mortuary. When his family learned of the tragedy from the two others on the hunt, they phoned David's sister-in-law. She lived in South Africa, and so was the closest family member to where he now lay. She agreed to formally identify him. It must have been traumatizing for her to see him like that, but she confirmed his identity, and the family were able to grieve their loss. Lieutenant Colonel Moachi Nagopi of South African Police Service was trying to piece together exactly what happened. Nobody from David's village was talking. Nobody confirmed whether the trio had been out poaching that night or not. Instead, the evidence needed to be gathered. Next to David's body lay the hunting rifles and a large amount of ammunition. These weapons indicated they were out looking for big game. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the scene, suggesting the other two sprinted away, given the length of the strides. Some may say that David got what he deserved. With so few tigers left, there is a higher demand for the use of lion bones in Asian tiger cake and wine. Anti-poaching patrols in South Africa often come across the corpses of lions. Their faces and paws have been hacked off, destined for a shipment to the Far East. Coming across such gruesome discoveries is so common now that the rangers and anti-poaching units no longer become emotional by what they see. There are now more elephants than lions in southern Africa, and their numbers are declining at a rapid rate. Habitat destruction and loss of prey from the bush meat trade, as well as conflict with farmers, are also leading to their demise, on top of the ever-growing poaching problem. As long as poaching continues, thousands more animals will die, and some of the poachers will meet their terrifying, final affliction. To say that Dr. Richard Root was a remarkable man is an understatement. After he graduated from Johns Hopkins University, specializing in infectious disease, he spent his career improving the various universities and hospitals across the U.S., even setting up new departments for potential doctors to study in the field of contagious illnesses. He went on to become the chief of medicine at the University of California and served as the chairman of the board of the American Federation of Medical Research, just to name a few. He also authored books. His name is on many, many research papers, and he spearheaded quite a few clinical studies himself. Harvard and Yale called on him from time to time to give lectures and introduce new forms of treatment to their students. Richard's sole purpose in life was to save as many lives as he possibly could. There was no shortage to his achievements, and there is no way to tell how many millions of lives his research saved before and after his death. At 68, Richard was ready to step away from the grueling hours of research and intensity of the lab. He'd always loved teaching, but his busy schedule almost never allowed him to fully submerge himself in training the next generation of doctors. So Richard, never one to take the easy road, traveled with his new wife, Rita, all the way to Botswana to combine his love for teaching and his devotion to human lives. He and a few of his colleagues were there on an invitation to help educate the country's medical staff on better and more advanced treatments for the growing HIV pandemic. The country, nestled on the southern tip of Africa, is one of the fastest developing nations on the continent. Their government has been making enormous strides in improving roads, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. They needed an expert in medicine to train their doctors and nurses in the newest technologies and medicines available, and they couldn't have asked for a better candidate than Dr. Root. The trip was only supposed to last 2 months, but Richard and Rita planned on making a little honeymoon out of it, in between Richard's work commitments, of course. Since being married, Richard's insane schedule kept them from having a proper honeymoon. So this was the ideal situation to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. Besides, finally being able to teach, he and Rita were looking forward to experiencing a foreign land with rich cultures and traditions, as well as amazing scenery and exotic animals. They were planning on making as many trips out of the city as they possibly could by taking every safari and hike that was available to them. But first, Richard needed to set up shop at the hospital where he was going to teach. Princess Marina Hospital is located right in the heart of the capital city, Gaborone, and right on the outskirts of the metropolis ran the Limpopo River, which also borders the neighboring country of South Africa. For 3 weeks, Rita got to know the city, and she kept herself busy setting up their living arrangements properly, while Richard got acquainted with the staff at Princess Marina. The couple felt welcomed immediately, and the doctors and nurses were eager to learn from the brilliant man. Richard put in many late nights and treated more patients than he could count in those first few weeks. But this was exactly what he thrived on, saving lives and teaching others to save even more. At 68, you'd expect him to already be retired, or at the very least, heading toward it. But Richard had never shown any signs of slowing down. All of the challenges that faced him there gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Luckily, Rita didn't mind. She knew who Richard was before she married him, and it was his passion and drive that made her fall in love with him in the first place. She took it in stride, knowing that all this hard work now would eventually let up enough for them to take the outings they were planning to take. Those first few weeks just flew by. Rita had their home furnished and organized, and Richard finally felt that he could take a day or 2 off to see some sights. They decided to start their travels around Botswana, right outside Gaborone, by taking a day trip in the Tule Nature Reserve. The Tule Nature Reserve is just one small part of a much larger protected area called the Tule Circle. In its entirety, it stretches for more than 800,000 hectares, with the Tule Nature Reserve making up 72,000 hectares in the center of it. The reserve has everything: game drives, canoe rides, more animals than you could imagine, upscale campsites and hotels scattered all over the terrain, and even safaris taken on horseback. On that fateful day in March 2006, Richard and Rita were out together in the company of 2 expert guides that would take them to see as much as they possibly could in 24 hours. The day started with a 3-hour drive to the Limpopo River. This doubled as a game drive for them, and they saw a herd of elephants, more bucks than they could identify, and they were even lucky enough to come across a pack of hyenas in the middle of devouring an oryx that they killed earlier that morning. Even the guides noticed that they were especially lucky to see so much wildlife that day. Not that the park had any shortage of life, but the group got more pictures and sightings in those 3 hours than most people got to see in 2 days. When they reached the river, they had a quick drink of water before heading to the canoes that were tied to a tree growing close to the bank. This next leg of their outing was a short canoe ride before stopping at a popular watering spot. This stretch of river was a very quiet one. There were no choppy rapids, and it was so well traveled by locals and tourists that even the animals avoided it. But the hour on the water was mostly for the scenery and bird watching anyway. They were just happy to relax on their little boats. But March is the start of autumn in southern Africa. This is the time of year when no plants are fruiting. The animals retreat deeper into the bush in search of food and also to seek out mates so that they can have their babies in time for spring. The waters aren't exactly teeming with life, so the crocodiles who rely on bucks that come in for a drink start to get hungry and desperate. In the week leading up to that day, there had already been half a dozen attacks by crocodiles on the Limpopo River, and 2 separate men had been reported missing after they went out to fish on the banks. The problem was that the Botswana authorities missed this unusual upswing in crocodile activity completely. All of the attacks happened to South African citizens on the south side of the river and were subsequently reported to South African authorities. With no communication between the 2 countries about the events, the guides went out completely unaware of the potential danger. Their only worry was keeping a lookout for hippos. Hippopotamuses are much more aggressive than any other creature living in the river, and they kill more humans every year than crocodiles do. So their eyes were scanning for the distinctive gray humps rising above the surface like boulders instead of scaled reptiles. Besides, there had never in all of the park's history been a sighting of a crocodile on that canoe route before, but that was all about to change. Early the previous day, a 15-foot monstrosity, ravenous and on the prowl, made its way right into the reserve's canoe route. For almost 2 days, it searched up and down the shores for something to eat, with no luck at all. When Richard and his guide got into the first canoe with Rita and her guide following close behind them, the animal was only a few yards away from them, lying in the late morning sun. They were the first signs of life it had picked up on since its arrival, and it was acutely aware of them before they even struck out with their paddles. It slipped under the water before they rowed by and followed the first canoe that went past it, which just so happened to be Richard's vessel, as they made their way downstream. Blissfully unaware of the danger stalking them from the depths below, the couple took pictures of the many bird species and continued to row at a lazy pace. The stalker kept its sights on the white fiberglass hull of the boat. It knew that people were riding on top of the strange crafts, and it hoped that they would get off and enter the water. But after half an hour of waiting and following, it became clear that the humans on the surface were not going to evacuate the safety of their vessels. It was then that the creature made the decision to strike out of its comfort zone. It would have to grab them right off the raft, and it needed to be quick about it. The thing about Nile crocodiles is that even though they prefer catching their prey from inside the water, they aren't limited to it. They can hunt just as well on land and easily outrun a grown man. They can also jump both in and out of the water. They didn't survive the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs for nothing. These creatures are incredibly versatile and adaptable to the challenges placed before them. This day was no different. There was prey to catch, and the reptile was going to find a way to get at it, no matter what. It snuck as close to the craft as possible. Only the very tip of its snout and its high-rising eyes were visible above the water, floating silently like twigs drifting with the current. It crept so close that it was only 3 feet from the lip of the canoe when the guide in the boat behind Richard noticed the almost invisible crocodile on their right. He managed to shout the word "Kuena" in their native Setswana language to warn them. But this burst of noise made the croc go into overdrive. The sudden shout sent it barreling out of the water like a whip. From her boat, Rita and her guide saw the animal propel out only 3 feet away from her husband. Almost gracefully, it leaped through the air, its jaws opening wide, almost seeming to fly at the vessel. It closed its teeth around the older man's right arm with a sickening crack that echoed so loudly across the landscape that it sent the birds in the distance up in the air in fright. Richard had no time to react. The reality of what had grabbed a hold of him barely registered before he was dragged off the boat, going into the river head first. The guide let go of the dangerously rocking boat and tried to grab hold of Richard's leg as it sailed past him, but he only got a handful of fabric that was ripped out of his grasp before he could get a good grip. The guide almost fell into the water himself, but somehow he managed to hold on. A mixture of blood and water blinded his eyes, and he furiously wiped his face with one hand while he reached for his paddle with the other. Almost simultaneously, the guides started rowing as fast as their arms could to get away from the scene. When Rita realized that they were speeding away from the spot where her husband was yanked, she snapped out of her shocked stupor and started yelling desperately for them to go back. Her guide had so much trouble containing her in the boat that they nearly capsized when she tried jumping into the river to go after Richard. But there was truly nothing any of them could do but get away from the danger. Those guides knew very well that the animal would kill them all if it needed to protect its kill. Poor Richard had just as little warning about what was about to happen as the rest of them did. One moment he was trying to focus his camera on a colorful bird, and the next there was a bang, a torrent of water, and his arm was grabbed with such force that the bones inside shattered instantly. He felt the pressure on his arm, the almighty yank, and the sudden submersion of the cold water. He was being dragged down so fast that he lost all sense of up and down. Only when they came to a rest at the very bottom of the river could he even attempt to get away. But now he was truly in the crocodile's domain. It released Richard, but before he could think of swimming up to the surface, it snapped its jaws around Richard's chest. The thing had no intention of ever letting Richard go. It just wanted to reposition its grip more securely on him. Richard opened his mouth to scream when the murderous rows of teeth sank into his chest, releasing what little air he still had in his lungs and flooding the empty space with water. His oxygen-deprived struggles did not faze the animal at all. It knew that the man was firmly locked in its jaws now. All it needed to do was keep its hold, lie still, and wait for the human to drown in the pitch-dark depths of the Limpopo River. Richard's fingers clawed at the thing's snout, but his struggles were weakening by the second. It took less than a minute for him to succumb to drowning, completely aware of the crushing pain in his chest every second of the way. The croc waited another 2 minutes just to make sure that the man was completely gone and the crafts up above had left before it swam back upstream to hide the body in a more secure place. On the surface, the tour guides finally got Rita under control. She even picked up her paddle and helped row them the rest of the way to the rest stop that they had been heading toward. Turning back wasn't an option. They had no idea where the animal had gone, and the rehabilitation center was closer to them than their starting point was anyway. It was the quickest way for them to get help. When they arrived, the staff were already waiting for the doctor and his wife with lunch, just as they had scheduled with them over the phone. The guides shouted the news about what had happened before they even docked. Calls were made, and the staff got Rita into a room to wait for authorities. They made sure that she wasn't alone for even a second, and that there was always a warm cup of tea for her. But she was in such a state of dumbfounded shock that she couldn't even muster the strength to bring the cup to her lips. When ambulance and police arrived, Rita was whisked away to be treated for shock, and when the police tried to question the guides, they realized that the man who accompanied Richard was in just as much of a state as Rita was. They didn't bother to wait for another ambulance. The resort manager drove the traumatized guide to the hospital himself. Rita's guide was willing to take them back to the place where the attack had occurred, and within the hour, rangers, hunters, and divers descended on the area in search of Richard. After 2 days, They finally called off the search. There was no sign of Richard or his assailant. They theorized that he was probably somewhere at the very bottom of the river, hidden under rocks or reeds. Crocodiles prefer to eat their prey in segments, coming back to their hiding places multiple times over the course of days or sometimes even weeks. And 4 days after the attack, when Richard's remains were washed up on the shore, their suspicions were confirmed. He was missing both of his arms, and his left leg was severed below the knee. All signs pointed to the animal feeding on the man over the course of the past 4 days, as he decayed underwater. But a stroke of luck must have dislodged Richard from his aquatic prison, and it caused him to float to the surface, where he was found by some locals who were stopping by the river to collect water. Richard was returned to the U.S., or at least what was left of him, so that he could receive a proper funeral. And by that time, every university he ever taught at, every hospital he worked, and every soul that encountered him had heard about the tragic news. To say that the medical world was rocked to its core is an understatement. The loss of such a brilliant, philanthropic man was an incredible tragedy for everyone who knew him. Even the doctors and nurses back at Princess Marina Hospital, who'd only known him for 3 weeks, held a memorial for Dr. Root, setting bouquets of flowers down on the Limpopo to float downstream, surrounded by birdsong and the setting sun. The predator in question was never found, nor was it ever sighted again. It seems almost impossible that a 15-foot beast could remain completely hidden from sight, but the dark depths of the freshwater currents belong to the prehistoric reptiles after all. And given how long crocodiles can live, it's almost certainly still out there, searching for someone else to bring to their final affliction. Although there are currently more than 1,000 different shark species, one extinct species has captured the world's attention since its discovery in 1835, the megalodon. Thought to be nearly 20 meters long, it would have been 3 times the size of the modern great white shark and would have dominated the seas before it died out 2.6 million years ago. Despite the species never being seen outside of fossilized remains, the prehistoric shark has become somewhat of an urban legend in recent years, as people debate whether it evaded extinction and now lives out at sea somewhere. Most dispel this as a myth, but what happens when a shark is spotted that's as big as a minibus? Although not a megalodon, a creature of that size living in our oceans is a terrifying thought. You might think, surely something like that can't exist outside the realms of the imagination, but you would be wrong, as Lloyd Skinner discovered when he found himself face to face with a dinosaur-esque predator. 37-year-old Lloyd Skinner was visiting South Africa for a month after finishing a stretch within a mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After a few hard months underground, rarely seeing the sun and putting his body through hell, he was excited for his holiday. He was planning to be in the country for a month before he headed to the United Kingdom for his next adventure, but he would never make it out of South Africa. On January 12, 2010, Lloyd decided he would spend the day in False Bay at Fishhook, which was home to a small but beautiful bay. Although the waves could be rough and there were a large number of sharks known to be in the area, he decided that today would be the day that he would go swimming. He loved to swim in the warm southern waters and prepared his trunks and goggles so he could make the most of his time in the water. Sadly, those goggles would turn out to be the cause of his savage death. As Lloyd and girlfriend Deborah arrived at the beach, they were disappointed by the weather, as it had become colder and cloudier since the morning. Now it was about midday and they had just arrived, but Lloyd was still determined to go swimming, regardless of how the weather would turn out. Deborah decided she would stay on the shore and sunbathe, meaning that Lloyd could safely leave all of his things with her without having to worry. With his mind unburdened, he headed into the water and began to swim out to sea. There were quite a few other people in the water, and he briefly acknowledged them as he passed by, but ultimately wanted to swim alone. He continued to swim until he was about 100 meters from shore, but it was still pretty shallow. He stood in the ocean with the water coming up to his chest, so he didn't consider himself to be particularly far out to sea. He could see the other swimmers in the distance, but was grateful for the space alone and quickly began to swim back and forth in what felt like his own private pool. After some time, Lloyd noticed his goggles were filling with some water, so he stopped to readjust them. Although the water was only to his chest, he couldn't see the seafloor. The waves were kicking up the sand so much that the water was dark and murky. He thought nothing of it, but little did he know that something was watching his legs from the depths. Lloyd put his goggles back on just in time as he was dragged under the waves. He had been tossed around for a few seconds under the water before he even realized what was happening. He had been attacked by a shark, and now his legs were bleeding profusely. Panicking, he began to shout for help and managed to get the attention of some people on shore as he waved and screamed that a shark had bitten him. There was a mixed reaction from those further into shore. Some began to swim out to his aid, while others swam away in a panic, hoping that if they reached the sand in time, then they wouldn't be the next victim of the massive fish. He felt a wave of relief as he saw his rescuers make their way towards him, but he had underestimated how far out to sea he was and how long it would take for help to arrive. As he tried to swim towards them, he was suddenly pulled underwater again. Lloyd felt sharp teeth sink deep into his abdomen as he screamed in agony. If there was any hope for him before, it was gone now. He turned to face his attacker through his goggles and was shocked at the sheer size of the animal before him. The animal's head dwarfed him, proving to him just how easily the shark could overpower him. The massive animal continued to bite down on his torso and shook him violently, determined that Lloyd would be its next meal. His vision was beginning to cloud, both from blood loss and the fact that the ocean was now a deep red color as the shark continued to rip him apart. For just a second, the shark let go of his body and he floated to the surface, barely fighting to keep his head above water to take his last breath. He could hear faint screams from the shore as people spotted his mangled body in the distance and could only imagine the horror that his girlfriend was feeling as she helplessly watched him bleed to death so far out to sea. With one last desperate look to shore, Lloyd was pulled below the water for the last time, where the shark took him far out to sea and devoured the poor man. The witnesses on the beach couldn't believe what they had just seen. One minute, everything was calm and serene, and the next, blood was pouring into the ocean, and they couldn't seem to figure out why. When they heard Lloyd screaming for help, they realized what had happened and panicked. From the safety of the shoreline, they watched in horror as the shark came back again and again, ripping into the man as he struggled to escape before it finally ripped him apart and dragged him out to sea. They were terrified by the size. It was at least 14 feet long, about the size of a minibus, which made Lloyd look like a doll in comparison as he was thrown around by the huge animal. It was a horrifying thing to see, but even as the rescuers got to the scene, they couldn't see any sign of him except for the massive amount of blood that had stained the ocean. They called for the emergency services, who began to search the ocean with 4 rescue boats and a helicopter, but they knew that there was no hope of finding Lloyd alive, judging from the descriptions that the witnesses had given. They were hopeful that they would be able to at least recover some body parts so that the family would have something to bury, but they couldn't find anything. The shark had devoured the man whole and left nothing behind. The locals began to worry as these shark attacks were becoming more and more common. A shark expert was consulted, and they determined that it was most likely a great white shark that had killed Lloyd Skinner due to its massive size and unique hunting style. A large shark had been spotted in the area just a few hours before the attack, but the shark flag was not raised to alert the people on the beach. Everyone on the beach that day continued to swim without any worry at all about sharks. If they had raised the flag when they first saw the shark, maybe this even could have been avoided, but unfortunately, it cost a man his life. There have been lots of discussions since then to figure out how to avoid these attacks, but most have been deemed too impractical or expensive to yield any worthwhile results. Some of these ideas included sonar buoys that could alert the lifeguards to the presence of a shark, or even some talk of an electrified system to send a shock to any approaching sharks before they had the opportunity to get too close, until a method that will prevent all sharks from entering the waters around the beaches. These brutal attacks will continue. The great white sharks around the coast of South Africa will always be lurking, waiting for its next meal, bringing another innocent person to their terrifying final affliction. Africa is no stranger to poachers. This problem that rages through the continent has nearly decimated the rhino populations completely, and countless other magnificent animals are in grave danger of being hunted out of existence, all just for their tusks, pelts, and to be traded under horrible and abusive conditions on the black market. But South Africa has been one of the leading fighters against these murderous crimes by fighting back against them with their own medicine. Long gone are the days when poachers were rounded up and released with only a slap on the wrist or a short prison sentence. Nowadays, illegal hunting is punishable by a sentence of time that is equal to first-degree murder, and the officers deployed to catch these hunters and trappers are given the right to kill on sight if they catch them. This is not just because the country is tired of losing its animals to this cruel and senseless practice. It's because the poachers themselves are armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons, and the officers out there looking for them are quite literally putting their lives on the line. More often than not, an altercation ends in a shootout. These officers are tough as nails. They're walking into an actual war zone when they take on the job. And once a team is assigned to one another, they become like family. They spend weeks on end in the bush, trekking and tracking, with only each other for company and under constant threat. You can't go to war without trusting the man next to you like you would a brother. Spamandla Matembu, 31, and his 3 fellow rangers were just that kind of team. They were out in November of 2023 at the Mkhuzi Game Reserve, just 180 miles north of the city of Durban. Spamandla was the senior officer of the 4, since he'd been working in the park for the past 8 years. Not that the other guys were wet behind the ears at all. They'd all worked in the profession for 3 years or more. Naturally, the most senior of the lot took charge. Luckily, the other guys didn't have a problem with this arrangement at all. Spamandla had a sharp eye, good aim, excellent tracking skills, and most of all, he commanded respect. He never lost his cool in the face of danger, always remaining calm and focused. Spamandla had just gotten back from a 2-week leave of absence to make arrangements for the funeral of his youngest daughter. The loss was a devastating one for his wife and 2 sons, but none more so than Spamandla. A usually stoic man was utterly crushed by her passing. He'd long wanted a daughter, and she was the apple of his eye, the only one who could soften the strong and serious man's heart. And she was not even 2 years old when she died. After the ordeal, he was glad to be back in the open air, with the ground beneath his feet and the sounds of nature to help him grieve. And the job did not disappoint. The moment he came back to work, they received a tip-off that there was a group of poachers in the area that were targeting elephants. There was no time for chit-chat, and no need for him to hide his feelings. The more urgent the case, the better. Spamandla just wanted to keep as busy as possible. Being alone with his grief was agony. No, this distraction was exactly what he needed now. Spamandla's team flanked one side of the herd, while another stayed on the other side, hoping to cover as much ground as possible. When the evening came, they were relieved by 2 new teams, making sure that the elephants were always under the watchful eyes of the rangers, only to repeat the process the next morning. Spamandla and his team spent 2 days searching for signs that people were in the area. Hours spent in absolute silence, their firearms at the ready, and following behind the herd at a safe distance. 2 kept their eyes on the field to look out for movement amongst the bushes and trees, while Spamandla and another man searched on the ground, looking for footprints, debris, and splashes of blood from a wounded animal. On the 3rd morning, at 5 o'clock sharp, just as they clocked in for the new shift, they finally found the remnants of a campfire and human debris. At last, they had a trail to follow. The hunt was on. For half an hour, they continued following the footprints. The elephants had gone for a morning drink, and inevitably the criminals followed suit, and the team weren't far behind. The ground beneath their feet squelched as they neared the river's mucky bank. Spamandla was at the head of the team, the others just a few yards behind, their rifles raised and at the ready. The elephants had trampled a path clear to the riverbank, and at its head there was a sharp bend. Spamandla came around the corner first, his eyes looking down at the boot prints ahead of him. He didn't even notice the gray mound resting on the muddy bank that was right in front of him. The hippo male jumped in shock at the tall figure striding so confidently toward it. Never in all its life had the king of the river ever had any animal or human walk up to it so confidently. Its anger was as instant as it was deadly. It shook off its surprise and bellowed in fury. Spamandla came to a sudden halt when the deafening roar broke the silence of the bush around him, and by the time he realized just what he'd walked into, he was just 6 yards away from the beast, practically right on top of it. The hippopotamus is not called the most mean-tempered animal in all of Africa for nothing. That thing was already charging when it opened its gigantic mouth to roar in anger. There was no running now, not against an animal that can cover 15 miles an hour on land. He was just too close to even try. Spamandla did the only thing he could do. He raised his rifle and managed to pull the trigger, letting one shot loose. Unfortunately, it hit the beast in the layers of thick fat on its shoulder. The creature didn't even react to the bullet that embedded in its body. It didn't bother to bite the man in front of it, or to pause, or stop from the blast. It simply steamrolled 1.5 tons right over Spamandla like he was nothing. That one charge drove the ranger several inches into the wet river bank, breaking almost every rib, both collarbones, and shattering both his legs in several places. His organs ruptured from the pressure, flooding his body with blood. Behind them, the 3 rangers heard the roar, a scream, and a single gunshot. They immediately fell into formation, guns loaded, and headed straight for the commotion ahead. Had it been anyone else, they would have faltered at the horrific sight that they ran into. But these guys had seen their fair share of death and blood. They did not hesitate to do what they had to. The hippo wasn't just satisfied by crushing the man. It turned back, grabbed Spamandla up in its mouth, and bit down with a bite force of 2,000 psi. The rangers opened fire, reloading their heavy hunting rifles after each round. One after the other, the bullets flew, yet the beast didn't stop. It just kept chomping down, opening its mouth and biting down again, shaking its head so furiously that Spamandla turned into a wild blur of flailing limbs and blood. It was as if its fury made it immune to pain. It took less than 15 seconds and almost a dozen rounds before it suddenly stopped, keeled over, and dropped down dead. Just like that, one moment it was consumed by a vicious, roaring anger, and the next a bullet finally landed right beneath one of its ears, puncturing its brain. Spamandla's lifeless body was still trapped in its jaws. There was so much blood that it created a stream of its own that trickled into the river, turning the water crimson. Even the hippo's body was no longer gray. It was as red as everything around it, and so was Spamandla. As one radioed in for help, the other 2 forced the jaws open and removed their teammate. Somehow he was still breathing, unconscious but still alive, but that was almost worse than if he'd been dead. For no more than 2 minutes, his gargled breathing drowned out the river stream, and the team listened to the terrible sound of his blood-filled lungs drowning from the inside. With every labored breath, more blood poured from the 9 gaping wounds that riddled his body. Spamandla was long dead by the time help arrived just 10 minutes later. Leaving the hippo behind without a second glance, they loaded Spamandla into the back of a jeep. They were just taking a body back to a family that were now grieving their second loss in less than a month. Only when they loaded their brother in the back of the ambulance did they finally give in to their horror and grief, collapsing into one another, bloody, exhausted, and utterly devastated. Spamandla's family, too, were inconsolable. The past few weeks had been a seemingly never-ending nightmare. They opted not to view the body at the morgue. His remains were so broken and torn up that it would have just added to the unbearable trauma that Spamandla's wife already had to deal with. Later, when a recovery team went back to remove the hippo, they found Spamandla's rifle. Its thick metallic muzzle was bent at a 90-degree angle from one of the animal's gigantic feet stepping on it. Its firing pins were removed, and it was hung in the Rangers' barracks as a tribute to the man they admired and loved, but also as a stark reminder that armed poachers aren't the only things out there that you should fear. And the poachers, well, they never caught them. It's certain that they were out there somewhere. But with the commotion of jeeps and scores of people flocking to the area, the elephants that they were targeting fled so quickly into the deeper park that it's assumed they gave up their chase, for the time being at least. Incidents like this, combined with the ever-present danger of dying in a gunfight, contribute to the substantial respect the anti-poachers receive. Every day on the job could be their last. Around every corner they could meet their terrifying final affliction. Pilanesberg National Park is a stronghold for both black and white rhinos in South Africa. It is situated in the Bojanala region, relatively near Johannesburg. Comprising an area of 550 square kilometers, it is the fourth largest park in South Africa and is home to a huge and diverse array of wildlife. In South Africa, poaching rhinos for their horns is sadly still a huge problem. Parks and reserves do their best to prevent poaching by setting up anti-poaching patrols, but sometimes it feels like a losing battle. In the last couple of years, Pilanesberg has taken the drastic decision to remove their rhinos' horns to stop the senseless massacre of these beloved animals. But still, the patrols continued as to protect the wildlife under threat. One of the rangers involved in the anti-poaching patrol was Kobus Murray. He was a veteran in the park, having served the rhinos for more than 12 years. He was experienced and knowledgeable. He was part of the canine unit which used dogs to sniff out trails left by poachers or particular animals if they needed to track either of them. His dog, Hailey, was a Belgian Malinois. She was as faithful to him as he was to her, and training her regularly was part of Kobus's routine. His wife, Charlotte, was a representative of Copenhagen Zoo living in South Africa with Kobus. The Danish zoo sponsored and paid for the training and use of dogs to support the rangers on their patrols. Kobus's and Charlotte's last dog, Dexter, was also part of the program but died unexpectedly 5 years before. Hailey was stepping into some very big paws. Kobus was seen as one of the senior rangers and often trained new recruits to be the best they could be. He knew that education was a big part of rhino conservation and would take Hailey with him to schools and tell them about the work they did together and the importance of preserving South Africa's wildlife. On February 6, 2021, Kobus and Hailey joined two rangers on the routine anti-poaching patrol. They drove along the perimeter fence, searching for any signs of forced entry or animals in distress. They bounced up and down in their seats as the vehicle rocked and lurched over the heavily rutted track. It was a Saturday morning before the rising sun burned intensely in the African sky. Nature was just waking up for the day, but for some, they had never slept. A predator lay concealed in the bushes. It could hear the vehicle approaching and remained still and silent. It was desperate. Thin and malnourished, this animal was very dangerous as it would take its chances at any easy meal. Kobus and the team paused the vehicle, and he and Hailey climbed out. Kobus was planning on setting a trail for his faithful companion, a regular training exercise for her. It was a Saturday, meant to be one of his days off, but he was devoted to his job and to the conservation of the rhinos in the reserve. The other two rangers continued along the fence line in the Land Rover. They rolled forwards, leaving Kobus behind. Although they hadn't gone far, they had made a terrible mistake. Unbeknown to them, there was an old male lion lurking in the bushes directly where they had left Kobus. Pushed out of the pride by the younger, stronger males, the male lion was now on his own. His hunting capacity as a lone ranger was limited. His speed wasn't what it once was, and he lacked the protection from the rest of the pride. He watched Kobus and Haile with glassy golden eyes, his battle-scarred snout twitching with their scent. He lay perfectly still amongst the undergrowth, hidden by the tall grass and scruffy brush. He was thin and hungry. The sound of the vehicle's engine petered out some way along to track. Kobus walked with his dog by his side, the sounds from the African bush filling his ears. Crickets chirped in the grass, hippos called from the branches, and a gentle breeze rattled through the bushes. He bent down to examine a disturbed patch of grass, and that's when the lion took its chance. It rushed forwards. Neither Kobus nor Haile saw it coming. Kobus didn't have time to reach for his firearm. He and his dog were caught completely off guard. There was just a flash of brown, and Kobus felt the hit. The enormous paws of the male lion wrapped around his shoulders, its jaws latched onto his head, and Kobus was knocked to the ground. He let out a yell and screamed for the lion to get off him. He could hardly see anything amongst the tussle. Flashes of beige and brown, glimpses of sharp white teeth, and a face full of fur. The ground beneath him was soft from recent rains. The spiky grass was lush and green. Kobus could feel the crushing sensation of the jaws. He could feel the ripping and tearing from the lion's claws across his torso. He grimaced as he tried desperately to push the lion off him, but its heavy body pinned him down. Momentarily, it released Kobus's head and bit him again and again. During the intense attack, Haile fled in a panic and cowered in the nearby bushes. Kobus's cries were heard by his fellow rangers, and they immediately swung the vehicle around and raced back to where they had left him. The Land Rover jumped and bounded along over the potholes. Acacia thorns scraped the paintwork, and the engine revved as they sped back to Kobus. They had only been a couple of 100 yards away. They made it to the spot where they had left their colleague, and that's when they saw their fellow ranger underneath the lion. They didn't hesitate. Immediately, they raised their rifles and fired several shots into the lion. It collapsed in a heap next to Kobus. They ran to his side, but it was too late. He had breathed his last breath right then and there. The wounds from the mauling were too extensive and devastating. The attack had severed blood vessels, and he had lost too much blood. He lay still, and it was clear that he could not be revived. In a state of shock, the Rangers called in backup. Officers and rangers arrived on the scene, and the lion was taken away to Andersdeport Veterinary Institute in Chouanet for a necropsy to determine exactly why it had attacked Kobus. There were no signs of disease, but the lion was old and thought to be starving. Its attack on Kobus was a last-ditch attempt at survival. His dog Haile was found nearby underneath a tree, unharmed but clearly shaken from the attack. She was taken back to base. The park lost one of their own that day, two of their own if you include the lion. Kobus was a deeply compassionate man. He worked tirelessly to ensure the safety of the animals. He was a true warrior in the fight against poaching and the illegal trade in rhino horn. That year, in 2021, 451 rhinos were poached in South Africa. This had increased by 13% from the year before. Anti-poaching patrols made 189 arrests in 2021, of which only 61 were successfully convicted. The penalty for poaching or smuggling rhino horn can be as much as 35 years in prison. It is obvious that the work rangers and anti-poaching units do is vital for the species' survival. The incident was a tragic case of 46-year-old Kobus being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fence he and his fellow rangers were searching along was supposed to keep lions out of that section. Even though that part of the park was known as the Big Five area, lions were cordoned off from the area Kobus was walking in. Somehow, it had made it through the fence in a desperate attempt to find food, leading to Kobus Marais's terrifying final affliction. March 22, 2014 in South Africa dawned bright and warm. Summer had just winded down the month before, and even though it was technically already autumn, that year the heat hung around long enough for just a little while longer. The Austrian group of tourists that landed down had chosen this time specifically. Early autumn is still warm enough to enjoy the beaches, but not so blisteringly hot that their light European skin would suffer in the African sun. Right on the very tip of the country, bordering the Indian Ocean, lies the small holiday town of Port St. John's. The Indian Ocean is much warmer than the sometimes freezing Atlantic Ocean that lies on the other side of the country. And as you can imagine, it's along this coastline where most of the swimming, surfing, and snorkeling happens. The beaches are almost always packed, unless it's in the dead of winter. And even then, there are always a handful of die-hard surfers still willing to go out into the waves. As popular a destination as Port St. John's is, it's not very well patrolled. The reality is that, of all of South Africa's nearly 3,000-mile coastline, every single inch of it is swarming with deadly sharks. Places like Jeffreys Bay, the Durban beaches, and Hartenbos are just busier and require the most attention. Port St. John's is not exactly on most tour groups' lists of hotspots. It's mostly frequented by locals, so it doesn't get as much traffic as the rest. You won't see any lifeguards here, and patrol vessels are at a minimum. Only the shark warning signs that dot the beach gives any indication that there might be any danger here. But in fact, it's one of the country's busiest breeding grounds for the colossal man-eating bull sharks. Had this group of Austrians, mostly made up of retirees, known this, maybe they'd have sought out another beach to cool off in. They only came to visit the iconic African safaris, the easy mountain trails, and they wanted to try out the local cuisine. But as soon as they landed, all of them decided that it was a good idea to find some water before heading inland to see the wild animals. Even along the coast, and in autumn no less, the heat was getting to them all. Frederick Bergstaller and his wife Margit practically threw themselves at the water when they arrived. The rest of the group were a little hesitant to get in themselves, not for fear of any danger. Instead, they found the packed beach a little claustrophobic. At 66, Frederick was still an excellent swimmer. He just needed to get past the first few shallow waves, and he'd be out of the crowd, where he could stretch out his arms and swim in the ocean that was virtually empty after those first few yards. Margit was content to roll up her pant legs and wade in the surf up to her ankles and watch her husband weave through the dozens of youngsters and families who were having an absolute ball, splashing and playing. All of the feet treading through the water was kicking up so much sand that there was virtually no visibility. The water just looked mucky and brown from above. But even if someone had been sharp enough to see a hint of the gray body that was stalking the swimmers from below, the noise of the beach would have dampened any shouts of warning. The animal had been moving just out of reach, hoping to hone in on one person in particular. But the mass of moving limbs was confusing. Every time it decided on a target, the whole mass of people's patterns shifted, and it had to start hunting all over again. That's until Frederick stepped into the water. Just as he got in up to his waist, he turned around to wave at Margit. Those few seconds he spent to stand still was enough for the shark to focus on him, and his stark white skin didn't help the situation much. Among the bodies and the shades of brown and black around him, Frederick stood out like a beacon in the murky water. It's almost no surprise that he was the one that the predator finally got a lock on. Poor Frederick was doomed the moment he set foot in the water. Frederick turned back to face the open sea, getting ready to dive headfirst in to catch some speed to swim out even farther, when the beast reared out of the dark. Frederick stumbled back, but it was too late, and the shark was too close. It grabbed him by both of his legs and lifted the man clear out of the water. It was like an explosion. One moment all was well, and the next there was absolute chaos when the animal and man burst out of the water, scattering the crowd instantly. Flecks of red and blue showered the people as they ran and shoved each other out of the way. The sudden uproar of stamping feet, splashes, and panicked screams were so deafening that it drowned out Frederick's own screams of fear and pain. The upsurge of chaos was so bewildering that the shark's jaws slacked for just a moment. That was all Frederick needed to rip himself free. Pushing with his hands against the animal's snout, he could feel the razor-sharp teeth tear through his skin as he pulled himself loose. In the instant that Frederick was free, he turned and began to run on his torn and shredded legs, but his limbs just couldn't hold him up after the beating that they just took. Frederick went down before he even took 2 steps in the direction of the retreating crowd. The beast was on him again. Horrified, Margit and the crowd saw Frederick pull back to throw a punch. He would have hit the approaching 2-meter-long monster square in the nose, but almost like it had been anticipating this very reaction, the shark opened his mouth just as Frederick's fist shot forward. His arm sank into the deep and dark gullet right up to his shoulder, and yes, the shark bit down, taking the entire right arm clean off the socket. Lifting his only remaining arm, Frederick attempted one last time to land a punch, but with legs that didn't work and a spewing hole where his right arm used to be, he simply sank beneath the surface with a final spray of blood that was swallowed by the water. Huddled on the sands, the crowd huddled in terror, no one daring to go into the vicious splashing that was happening just yards from them. Helpless, they were forced to watch as the shark fed on Frederick right in front of their eyes. Margit, hysterical, attempted to run into the surf, but 2 South African teenagers stopped her from running to her death. She struggled so fiercely that one of the boys, a 19-year-old, had to push her into the sand and sit on top of her to keep her out of the water. He begged for her to stop, while the other boy grabbed her hand, promising to stay with her. The terrible scene went on for another 15 minutes before the waters finally became still and there were no longer any signs of violent splashing. And only then did emergency services arrive. But their only job now was to fish what was left of Frederick out of the water and to get the traumatized Margit to the hospital. That young boy held onto her hand until the ambulance doors closed and he was left standing on the beach watching the ambulance drive away. Another vehicle took Frederick's remains away. Besides his right arm, Frederick's entire lower body was gone, and most of the organs in his abdomen had spilled out too. You'd think that such a gruesome death would mean the end of swimming at Port St. John's. But no, less than an hour later the surf was full of people again, none of them even aware of the terrible attack that had just happened in the very waters that they were swimming in. And even now, 14 years later, there are still no lifeguards or boats patrolling the waters, just a handful of signs that stand crooked and rusting in place to warn swimmers of the danger beneath the waves, until someone else is inevitably taken by the gray monsters that lurk beneath the surface and meets their own terrifying final affliction.